She was just the help, until one night, she exposed the billionaire's secret. Now, he won't let her go. Hey family, before we begin the story, I'm your host, Dr. Tom. If you're just joining us for the first time, quickly hit that subscribe button and kindly let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Trust me, this story will challenge everything you think you know about love and courage. Also, if you enjoy today's story, don't forget to like, comment, and rate it from 0 to 10. Now, let's dive in. The Willis Tower stretched into the Chicago sky like a monument to power, its glass walls reflecting the ambitions of those who worked within. On the 52nd floor, behind doors marked Preston Associates, million-dollar cases were won and lost daily. But at 4 a.m., when the city still slumbered and the lawyers had long since retreated to their penthouses, the real work began. Clara Morales pushed her cleaning cart through the marble lobby, the wheels squeaking in rhythm with her tired steps. At 26, she carried herself with the quiet dignity her father had taught her, shoulders straight, head up, even when the world insisted on looking through her. The brass nameplate on her cart read, C. Morales, Evening Maintenance. But in 4 years, not a single attorney had bothered to learn her name. The law firm of Preston Associates specialized in one thing: making problems disappear for corporations with deep pockets. Environmental disasters, workplace accidents, consumer fraud. If a company needed legal protection from the consequences of their greed, Preston Friend H. Associates was their salvation. Clara had watched it all unfold from the shadows, invisible as furniture, forgotten as yesterday's news. She arrived every morning before dawn, carrying the same worn toolbox her father had used for 20 years before his heart gave out in these very hallways. Juan Morales had scrubbed these floors, polished these windows, emptied these trash cans until exhaustion claimed him. The doctors said it was cardiac arrest, but Clara knew better. Her father had died of overwork, of caring too much about a job that never cared about him. "Mija," he used to tell her as they walked home through the pre-dawn streets. "We may clean their messes, but we don't have to carry their shame." Those words became her armor against the dismissive glances and condescending tones of people who saw her as nothing more than part of the building's fixtures. As Clara worked through the offices, she noticed things others missed. Late-night strategy sessions where lawyers planned how to bury evidence, conference calls about witness coaching, documents carelessly left on desks that revealed the true cost of corporate negligence. She had taught herself to read legal terminology by studying the papers she found in trash bins, learning procedures by listening through thin walls when depositions ran late. The Morrison chemical disaster case had consumed the firm for 8 months. A massive explosion at a processing plant had killed 15 workers and contaminated miles of Lake Michigan shoreline. The families of the dead were seeking justice, demanding accountability from Morrison Industries. Preston Associates naturally represented the corporation. Clara had watched the systematic destruction of truth unfold before her eyes. She saw lawyers coach witnesses to lie about safety protocols they knew had been ignored. She witnessed bribes passed to government inspectors in sealed envelopes. She heard phone calls where evidence was discussed not as facts to be preserved, but as problems to be eliminated. The lead attorney, Robert Preston himself, treated the case like a chess game, where human lives were merely pawns to be sacrificed. During late-night strategy sessions, Clara heard him laugh about the bleeding heart families who thought they could challenge corporate power. His office overlooked the lake, the same waters that Morrison Industries had poisoned. But the irony seemed lost on him. These people need to understand reality. Preston told his associates during one meeting Clara overheard while emptying wastebaskets. Accidents happen. That's why we have insurance and legal departments. Emotional manipulation won't change the law. But Clara knew it wasn't an accident. She had pieced together the truth from fragments of conversations, shredded memos, and discarded reports. Morrison Industries had known about the faulty safety systems for months before the explosion. They had chosen profits over protection, deadlines over human lives. The breakthrough came on a cold February night. Clara was working late, preparing for the next day's final hearing, when she discovered something that made her hands tremble. In the conference room wastebasket, beneath coffee cups and takeout containers, lay the torn remains of a document that proved everything. The internal memo, dated 6 months before the explosion, detailed Morrison Industries' knowledge of critical safety failures in their chemical processing equipment. Engineers had recommended immediate shutdowns for repairs. Management had ignored the warnings, citing production quotas and quarterly profit targets. Clara spent 2 hours in that empty conference room, carefully reassembling the shredded pages by the light of her phone. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes, mija, doing the right thing means everything changes." She thought about the Morrison families she had seen on the news, widows struggling to pay mortgages, children who would grow up without fathers, neighbors whose wells were contaminated by corporate negligence. She thought about her own father, who had died invisible and unremembered, with no one to fight for his dignity. The next morning, Clara Morales made a decision that would alter the course of her life forever. Instead of reporting to work, she put on her mother's black dress, the one reserved for funerals and graduations, and walked into the Cook County Courthouse, carrying a manila envelope that contained the truth Morrison Industries had tried to destroy. The courtroom was packed. Families of the victims sat in the front rows, their faces etched with grief and determination. Behind them, reporters waited for what they expected would be Preston Spinal Associates' final victory. The defense had systematically dismantled every piece of evidence the plaintiffs had presented, leaving them with nothing but tears and testimony. But among the observers sat someone unexpected: James Whitfield, CEO of Whitfield Clean Energy Corporation. At 35, he had built a renewable energy empire worth $15 billion, specifically designing technology to prevent the kind of industrial disasters that had claimed the Morrison workers. His presence commanded respect, even in silence, tall, sharp-featured, with dark eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the proceedings. James had come to observe because his company was developing clean alternatives to the exact type of equipment that had failed at Morrison Industries. He sat quietly in the third row, taking notes, his expensive suit understated but unmistakable. Unlike the other observers, he wasn't there for the spectacle. He was there to understand how corporate negligence could be defended so skillfully that truth became irrelevant. As Robert Preston delivered his closing argument with theatrical confidence, Clara felt her resolve wavering. The attorney's voice boomed through the courtroom. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs have failed to provide a single piece of credible evidence proving negligence. Industrial accidents, while tragic, do not automatically constitute criminal acts. Morrison Industries followed all applicable regulations and industry standards." Clara gripped the envelope tighter. She could walk away now, return to her invisible life, let the system protect those with power while abandoning those without it. The safe choice was silence. The smart choice was invisibility. But then she looked at the Morrison families, at Maria Morrison, whose husband had been killed trying to shut off emergency valves that should have worked automatically, at the 3 Morrison children who would never see their father again, at the neighbors whose health had been compromised by contamination that could have been prevented. In that moment, Clara saw her father's face in theirs. She saw every worker who had ever been forgotten, every voice that had been silenced, every truth that had been buried for the convenience of those in power. James Whitfield noticed her before anyone else did. Something in her posture, the way she sat forward, the intensity in her eyes, as she studied the proceedings, caught his attention. She didn't look like the other observers. There was purpose in her stillness, determination in her silence. And then, as Robert Preston concluded his argument with a dismissive wave toward the plaintiffs, Clara Morales stood up. The moment stretched like held breath. Every head in the courtroom turned toward the young woman in the simple black dress, holding an envelope that would change everything. "That's not true," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like lightning through darkness. The transformation had begun. "My family, before we continue, I need to know something. Have you ever been in a moment where doing the right thing could cost you everything? Drop a comment and tell me about it. Your courage might inspire someone else to find theirs. And if this story is already gripping you, hit that like button. It tells me you're ready for what comes next." The words hung in the air like thunder before the storm breaks. Every person in that courtroom, from the judge to the court reporter to the security guards by the door, froze, as if time itself had stopped to witness what was about to unfold. "That's not true." Clara's voice, though quiet, carried the weight of 4 years of silence finally broken. Robert Preston's confident smile vanished. The judge leaned forward, confusion creasing his weathered face. In the gallery, James Whitfield felt something electric shoot through his chest as he watched this unknown woman stand against one of Chicago's most powerful law firms. "Order!" Judge Harrison called out, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "Ma'am, who are you? How did you get into this courtroom?" Clara stepped forward, her legs trembling but her voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm Clara Morales. I clean the offices at Preston Associates." She held up the manila envelope, and I found what they tried to destroy. The courtroom erupted like a dam bursting. Robert Preston was on his feet, his face cycling through shock, rage, and panic. "Your Honor, this is clearly a desperate stunt by opposing counsel. This woman is obviously unstable, probably paid—" "I work for your firm, Mr. Preston," Clara interrupted, her voice cutting through his protests like a blade. "For 4 years, I've watched you destroy evidence, coach witnesses to lie, and laugh about the families whose lives you're destroying. This document proves that Morrison Industries knew about the equipment failure 6 months before the explosion killed 15 innocent people." Gasps rippled through the packed courtroom. Reporters were already pulling out phones, frantically typing updates. The Morrison families were crying not tears of grief this time, but tears of vindication, of hope they thought had died with their loved ones. James found himself leaning forward, completely captivated. There was something about the way this woman held herself, dignity wrapped in determination, courage clothed in simplicity, that made everyone else in the room seem small by comparison. She wasn't performing for cameras or playing to the crowd. She was simply telling the truth, and the truth was devastating. Judge Harrison pounded his gavel repeatedly, but the chaos only intensified. "Ms. Morales, are you represented by counsel? Do you understand the legal implications of what you're saying?" Clara's throat was dry, her hands shaking, but her voice never wavered. "I understand that 15 people died because a company valued quarterly profits over human lives. I understand that families lost fathers and husbands because executives decided safety repairs could wait until after the Christmas bonus calculations. And I understand that staying silent makes me complicit in their deaths." She walked forward through the chaos, past reporters scrambling for better angles, past corporate executives whispering urgently to their legal teams, past everything that represented power and privilege and corruption. When she reached the bailiff, she handed him the envelope with steady hands. "This is the internal memo they shredded. It details every safety violation Morrison Industries knew about and chose to ignore. These families deserve to see justice, not legal manipulation." That's when James Whitfield did something that surprised even himself. He stood up and began to applaud. The sound of his hands coming together cut through the courtroom noise like a church bell. Other observers turned to look, but James didn't care. He had just witnessed the most extraordinary act of moral courage he'd ever seen, and he wasn't going to let it pass without recognition. One by one, others joined him. First the Morrison families, then other observers, then even some of the court staff. The applause built into something thunderous, something that said this woman had done what none of them had dared to do. Robert Preston was shouting about sanctions and contempt charges, but his voice was lost in the sound of recognition for someone who had finally spoken truth to power. Judge Harrison examined the reassembled documents with growing astonishment. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, devastating to Morrison Industries' defense. After 20 minutes of consultation with legal clerks and opposing counsel, he made his ruling. This court will reopen the Morrison versus Morrison Industries case for further proceedings. New evidence will be examined, and if proven authentic, this case will proceed to a full criminal investigation. 3 months later, the settlement was announced. $300 million to the victims' families, the largest corporate negligence payout in Illinois history. Morrison Industries' CEO and safety director were sentenced to federal prison. The company itself was forced into bankruptcy, its assets sold to pay for environmental cleanup of Lake Michigan. But on that February morning, as Clara was escorted from the courtroom by bailiffs, not as a criminal, but for her protection from the media frenzy, she felt smaller than ever. The weight of what she'd done was crushing her. She had just ended her career, possibly her future, definitely her invisibility. The courthouse steps were chaos personified. Reporters shouted questions from every direction. Camera flashes blinded her. Microphones were thrust into her face like weapons. She felt like prey being circled by predators, each one hungry for a piece of her story. Ms. Morales, what motivated you to come forward? Were you paid by opposing counsel? How long have you known about this cover-up? What's next for you legally? The questions came too fast, too loud, too aggressive. Clara felt herself shrinking, disappearing back into the invisibility that had protected her for so long. This was a mistake. She should have stayed quiet, stayed safe, stayed forgotten. That's when a calm, authoritative voice cut through the chaos. "Excuse me, Ms. Morales needs space." She looked up to see a tall man in an expensive suit, gently but firmly, creating a barrier between her and the reporters. His presence was so commanding that they actually stepped back, giving her room to breathe for the first time since leaving the courtroom. "James Whitfield, Whitfield Clean Energy Corporation," he said to the reporters, his tone polite but final. "Ms. Morales has had an extraordinary day. I'm sure she'll speak to the media when she's ready." He turned to Clara, and she found herself looking into the most honest brown eyes she'd ever seen. There was no calculation in his gaze, no agenda, just genuine concern for a stranger who had done something remarkable. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. I think so. Thank you. Can I offer you a ride somewhere away from all this?" Clara hesitated. She didn't know this man, but something about his calm presence in the storm felt like safety in a world that had suddenly become dangerous. "I don't even know who you are." He smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen all day. "I'm someone who just watched the most courageous thing I've ever seen in my life. And I'd very much like to buy you coffee and tell you that." 20 minutes later, they were sitting in Rose's Cafe on Chicago's South Side, a small neighborhood place where the coffee was strong and the tables were worn smooth by years of honest conversation. James had dismissed his driver, insisting they take the L train. "I want to understand your world," he had said simply. Over coffee and fresh pastries, Clara learned that James Whitfield wasn't just another billionaire. His company pioneered clean energy technology specifically designed to prevent industrial disasters like the Morrison explosion. "I've been fighting corporate negligence from boardrooms and congressional hearings for 10 years, he said. "You just accomplished more in 10 minutes than I have in a decade." "I just did what was right," Clara said quietly. "That's exactly what makes it extraordinary." They talked for hours as the afternoon light faded over the city, about justice and family, about the weight of doing right when the world expects you to stay silent. James told her about growing up with every privilege imaginable but feeling empty until he found purpose in meaningful work. Clara told him about her father, about learning law from discarded documents, about the loneliness of being invisible in a world that only noticed you when you disrupted their plans. "You're not invisible to me," James said, as the sun began to set behind the Chicago skyline. "You're the most extraordinary person I've ever met." Clara felt her heart skip. "You don't even know me. I know you risked everything for strangers. I know you see injustice and refuse to accept it. I know you have more integrity in your heart than most people accumulate in a lifetime." He leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'd like to know everything else about you, if you'll let me." In that small cafe, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of neighborhood life, something remarkable began to bloom between a billionaire and a custodian who had both learned that real wealth comes from doing what's right, regardless of the cost. The phone calls started at sunrise the morning after Clara's courtroom testimony. By noon, her small apartment in Pilsen buzzed with opportunity like a hive awakened. Law firms across Chicago, names she'd only seen on letterheads while emptying their trash, wanted to hire her. Not as a custodian this time, but as an investigator, a paralegal, even as an attorney if she could pass the Illinois bar. "Ms. Morales, this is Jennifer Chang from the Cook County Public Defender's Office," came one particularly compelling call. "What you did yesterday was remarkable. We need people who understand how the system really works from the ground up, people who see what others miss." The Chicago Tribune dubbed her the custodian who cleaned up justice. CNN wanted an exclusive interview. Legal analysts debated her actions on morning talk shows. 3 major law firms offered her starting salaries that exceeded what her father had earned in his entire lifetime. But it was the Illinois State Bar Association that made the call that changed everything. They were creating an unprecedented program allowing Clara to challenge the bar examination based on her demonstrated legal knowledge and extraordinary service to justice. A legal defense fund, started by donations from people inspired by her courage, had already raised over $400,000 to support her education and transition. "This is your moment, Clara," her mother had said, tears streaming down her weathered face as she watched her daughter on the evening news. "Your papa would be so proud. You're not just cleaning up their messes anymore, you're making them clean up their own." The choice came easily. While prestigious firms offered corner offices and 6-figure salaries, Clara chose the Cook County Public Defender's Office. "I want to help people like my father," she told Jennifer Chang during her interview. "People who work hard, play by the rules, and get forgotten when the system fails them." 6 months of intensive study followed. Clara approached the bar exam like she had approached everything else in her life, with quiet determination and relentless focus. She studied at the same kitchen table where she'd done homework as a child, surrounded by her father's tools and her mother's prayers. The results were announced on a crisp October morning. Clara Morales had not only passed the Illinois bar examination, she had achieved the highest score recorded that year. Her swearing-in ceremony took place in the same courthouse where she'd made her stand. As Judge Harrison administered the oath, Clara looked out at the small crowd gathered to witness her transformation. Her mother sat in the front row, clutching a photograph of her late husband. Colleagues from the public defender's office cheered from the side, and in the back, trying to remain unobtrusive but impossible to miss, sat James Whitfield. He had been there for every milestone the bar results announcement. Her first day at the public defender's office, her first case victory, always supportive, always respectful of her independence, never trying to overshadow her achievements with his wealth or influence. "Congratulations, Counselor Morales," he said afterward, his pride evident in every word. The title sounded strange on her lips, wonderful in her ears. Their relationship had been growing steadily, built on coffee shop conversations and long walks through Grant Park. James had introduced Clara to his world, gradually, not the glittering charity events and society functions, but the meaningful parts. She attended groundbreaking ceremonies for clean energy projects, met engineers developing safety technology that could prevent future tragedies. He showed her how wealth could be a tool for justice, not just comfort. 3 weeks after her swearing in, James took Clara to Navy Pier for dinner. The Chicago skyline glittered across the water like scattered diamonds, and the October air carried the scent of autumn and possibility. "I have something to tell you," James said as they walked along the pier after dinner. Lake Michigan lapping gently against the wooden supports below them. Clara turned to face him, and in the moonlight reflected off the water, She could see vulnerability in his usually confident expression. Her heart began to race, knowing that whatever he was about to say would change everything between them. "I've never met anyone like you, Clara. You've changed how I see everything. Courage, integrity, what really matters in life." He took her hands in his, and she could feel them trembling slightly. "I fell in love with you the moment you stood up in that courtroom. Actually, I think I fell in love with your courage first, and then with every part of you that followed." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "James, I know we come from different worlds. I know this might seem complicated or impossible to others, but I also know that you make me want to be worthy of the kind of person who risks everything for strangers." "You already are," she whispered, and when he kissed her beneath the Chicago stars, Clara felt like she was soaring over the lake, over the city, over every limitation that had ever tried to define her. For 2 months, they existed in perfect harmony. James's wealth complemented Clara's justice work beautifully, his resources opening doors that had been closed to the families she represented, her insights guiding his company toward projects that would prevent future industrial disasters. They attended charity events together, quiet dinners, long weekends exploring Chicago's neighborhoods. James learned to appreciate hole-in-the-wall restaurants and community centers. Clara grew comfortable in elegant settings without losing herself in them. James's family, however, had been carefully absent from their relationship. He spoke little about his parents, deflecting questions with mentions of business travel and scheduling conflicts. Clara sensed the hesitation but didn't push. She had learned that some conversations came in their own time. That time arrived on a cold December evening, when James suggested they drive to Lake Forest for dinner. "My parents are hosting a small gathering," he said carefully. "Nothing formal, just family and a few close friends. I think it's time you met them." The Whitfield estate emerged from the winter landscape like something from a different century. Stone pillars flanked the entrance to a property that seemed to stretch endlessly into manicured darkness. The mansion itself was all old-money elegance, tasteful, imposing, designed to remind visitors of their place in the world's hierarchy. Victoria Whitfield greeted them at the door with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. She was a woman in her early 60s who had never worked a day in her life, but considered herself an expert on worthiness and social positioning. Her greeting to James was warm, maternal. Her acknowledgement of Clara was arctic. "So," Victoria said over dinner, her voice carrying the particular sweetness that preceded cruelty, "Clara, tell us about your family. What do your parents do?" The dining room fell silent, except for the gentle clink of crystal and silver. James's younger sister, Charlotte, looked up from her wine with barely concealed amusement. His father, Robert Whitfield Sr., cleared his throat uncomfortably, but said nothing. "My father was a maintenance worker before he passed away," Clara answered honestly, her voice steady despite the charged atmosphere. "My mother works at a laundromat in Pilsen." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. Charlotte smirked into her wineglass. The other dinner guests, all old-money families with familiar Chicago surnames, suddenly found their plates fascinating. "How interesting," Victoria said, the word dripping with condescension. "And you, dear, you worked in maintenance as well, before your recent career change?" "I was a custodian at Preston Associates. Now I'm an attorney with the Public Defender's Office." "Public defense," Victoria repeated, as if the words tasted unpleasant. "How noble of you to help those people." The way she said "those people" made Clara's skin crawl. These were the families she fought for, the communities she came from, the forgotten Americans whose lives mattered just as much as anyone sitting around this table. "I help people who can't afford justice otherwise," Clara replied, her professional composure intact, despite the growing hostility in the room. "Of course you do," Victoria said with false warmth. "How admirable. And how did you and James meet? Through work, I assume?" James tried to intervene, but Clara had spent too many years being invisible to wealthy people to be intimidated now. I exposed corporate negligence that your son's company helps prevent. James was in the courtroom when I testified. The Morrison Industries case, Robert Sr. said suddenly, speaking for the first time all evening. I read about that. Quite a settlement. 15 people died because executives prioritized profits over safety, Clara said firmly. The settlement was justice delayed, not justice denied. Victoria's smile finally faltered. Well, you certainly have strong opinions about things. The evening deteriorated from there. Pointed questions about Clara's education, her background, her suitability for their social circle, whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, looks of barely concealed disgust at her department store dress and discount shoes. After dinner, James found Clara on the estate's stone terrace, staring out at Lake Michigan in the distance. Tears were streaming down her face, not from sadness, but from a humiliation so profound it felt like drowning. They hate me, she said without turning around. They don't know you. Your mother looked at me like I was something she needed to scrape off her designer heels. James moved behind her, wrapping his arms around her shoulders. I don't care what they think. I care about you. But Clara could see the strain in his reflection in the glass door. This was his family, his heritage, his legacy. She was asking him to choose between the woman he loved and the world that had shaped him. Maybe they're right, she whispered. Maybe we're too different. Different is what makes us stronger. Different is what tears families apart. The drive back to Chicago was silent, both of them processing what had happened. At Clara's apartment building, James walked her to the door like he had dozens of times before. But this time, something had shifted between them. This doesn't change anything, he said, cupping her face in his hands. It changes everything, she replied. And you know it. As she watched his car disappear into the Chicago night, Clara realized that love might not be enough to bridge the gap between their worlds. For the first time since standing up in that courtroom, she felt truly afraid not of poverty or struggle, but of losing the one person who had ever seen her completely and loved her anyway. The Whitfield family had drawn their battle lines. The question now was whether love could survive the war they were about to wage. Family, I have to pause here because my heart is racing. Just telling you this. Can you feel that tension? That moment when love meets prejudice? Share this story with someone who needs to hear that they're worthy of love, regardless of their background. And subscribe if you believe love should conquer social barriers, because what happens next will test that belief to its limits. The war began quietly, as the most devastating campaigns often do. Victoria Whitfield understood that direct confrontation had failed. Clara had proven too resilient for crude attacks. So she shifted tactics, employing the subtle weapons of Chicago's elite: social pressure, strategic positioning, and the slow erosion of confidence that comes from constant questioning of one's place in the world. The first salvo came disguised as family tradition. The monthly Whitfield Charity Board meeting, previously a small affair of close associates, suddenly expanded to include the most eligible women in Chicago's social circle. Amanda Thornton, whose family owned half of Michigan Avenue's retail district. Catherine Blackstone, recently divorced from a tech mogul and hungry for her next conquest. Claire Davidson, whose Harvard law degree and trust fund made her what Victoria considered the perfect daughter-in-law material. James, darling, Victoria would coo at these gatherings. You simply must meet Catherine. She just returned from her humanitarian work in Geneva. Such a worldly perspective on international law. Or, Amanda has been asking about your renewable energy projects. She's thinking of investing her family foundation's resources in clean technology. Each introduction was calculated. Each conversation strategically guided toward topics that highlighted what these women could offer, that Clara could not: connections, social standing, and inherited understanding of their world's unspoken rules. James endured these encounters with increasing irritation, but Victoria was patient. Water eventually wore away stone. The private investigator came next. Victoria hired Richard Cross, a former FBI agent who specialized in background checks for wealthy families protecting their interests. His assignment was simple: find anything in Clara Morales' past that could be used to demonstrate her unsuitability for the Whitfield name. Cross spent 3 weeks digging through records, interviewing neighbors, following paper trails. What he found infuriated Victoria more than if he'd discovered genuine scandal. Clara's life was boringly clean: no criminal record, no questionable associations, no financial impropriety. Her mother was beloved in their neighborhood for helping families during hard times. Her late father was remembered as the hardest-working, most honest man anyone had known. "There's nothing there, Mrs. Whitfield," Cross reported during their final meeting. "She's exactly what she appears to be: a woman from a working-class family who's built something meaningful through her own efforts." "Keep looking," Victoria commanded, unwilling to accept defeat. "Ma'am, I've looked everywhere. This woman is cleaner than most debutantes I've investigated. Her only crime is being born poor." Victoria dismissed him with barely concealed contempt, but the message was clear. Clara couldn't be destroyed through traditional scandal. She would have to be undermined through other means. Family dinners became exercises in psychological warfare. Every gathering featured pointed comments about that Morales girl, and speculation about when James would tire of his social experiment. The phrases were carefully chosen for maximum impact, never outright cruel. Enough for James to storm out, but sharp enough to draw blood. "I do hope James realizes this phase will pass," Charlotte would say within Clara's earshot during public events. "He's always been attracted to charity cases. The poor dear probably thinks she's actually suitable for our family," Victoria would murmur to her social circle, loud enough to ensure the gossip reached the right ears. Someone should really explain to her how these things work. The accusations grew bolder as months passed. During a particularly tense family dinner in February, Victoria finally abandoned subtlety. "She's using you for your money, James," she declared over dessert, her voice calm but vicious. "Girls like that always do. They see dollar signs before they see love." "Girls like what, Mother?" James's voice was dangerously quiet. "Poor girls. Desperate girls. Girls who understand that marrying up is easier than working up. Clara has her own career, her own success, built on the publicity from that courtroom stunt. Without that moment, she'd still be emptying our trash cans." James stood so abruptly his chair nearly toppled. That stunt sent 3 executives to prison and gave justice to 15 families. That girl has won 12 major cases in 8 months and turned down 6-figure offers to work for people who can't afford lawyers. And you don't think it's convenient how she landed in your lap right after becoming famous? "She didn't seek me out. I sought her out, because I recognized something extraordinary when I saw it." "You recognized a pretty face with a sad story." James left without another word, but the damage was accumulating. Each fight with his family left visible marks: tension in his shoulders, exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of constantly defending their relationship against people he'd loved his entire life. Clara watched it all with growing anguish. She attended fewer family events, making excuses about work obligations. She saw how James's relationship with his parents grew colder, how his sister's wedding planning excluded her entirely, how old family friends began treating James with confused disappointment. Meanwhile, her professional life was soaring. The Peterson versus Midwest manufacturing case resulted in a $50 million settlement for workers exposed to toxic chemicals. The Kowalski environmental suit led to the cleanup of 3 contaminated neighborhoods. Harvard Law School invited her to speak about justice and corporate accountability. The Chicago Tribune named her one of 40 under 40 legal leaders to watch. "You're becoming everything you dreamed of," James told her after a particularly successful court appearance. His pride was genuine, but Clara could see the strain around his eyes. "And you're losing everything you've always had," she replied quietly. "I'm not losing anything that matters." "Your family matters, James. Your history, your relationships, that's not nothing. You matter more." But late at night, alone in her apartment, Clara questioned whether that was fair to ask of him. She watched interviews with his mother on society pages, read gossip column mentions of James appearing at events with family friends instead of his girlfriend. She saw the exhaustion that came from constantly fighting battles on her behalf. The breaking point approached like storm clouds gathering over Lake Michigan, inevitable, devastating, and impossible to prevent. Victoria's final gambit came on a gray March morning when Clara was reviewing case files in her apartment, preparing for a crucial hearing. The knock on her door was unexpected visitors to her modest Pilsen neighborhood, usually called First. She opened the door to find Victoria Whitfield standing in the hallway, looking as out of place as a diamond in a coal mine. The older woman was impeccably dressed in a designer coat that probably cost more than Clara's monthly rent. Her expression pleasant but predatory. "Mrs. Whitfield, this is unexpected. May I come in? I think it's time we spoke honestly." Clara stepped aside, acutely aware of her small apartment. Through Victoria's eyes, the second-hand furniture, the law books stacked on every surface, the framed photo of her parents on their wedding day. It was clean and organized, but it was also undeniably modest, a world away from the Whitfield estate's luxury. Victoria declined the offer of coffee and remained standing in the center of the small living room, her presence somehow making the space seem even smaller. "You're a smart woman, Clara, smarter than I initially credited. So you must see that this situation with my son cannot continue. Because I'm not good enough for him? Because you're not right for this life." Victoria's tone was businesslike now, the false pleasantries abandoned. James needs someone who understands his responsibilities, his obligations, his position in Chicago society. Someone who can navigate board meetings and diplomatic dinners, who can raise children who will inherit not just wealth but legacy. Clara felt anger building in her chest, but Victoria continued before she could respond. "You've built something admirable for yourself. You have a promising career, media attention, the respect of your peers. You've achieved more than most people ever will. Why would you want to sacrifice that independence to become an accessory to someone else's life?" The question hit harder than Clara expected because it contained an uncomfortable grain of truth. She had worked so hard to become Clara Morales, attorney at law. Was she ready to become Mrs. James Whitfield instead? "You don't love him," Clara said quietly. "I love him enough to want what's best for him, even when he can't see it himself. And you think I'm not what's best for him?" Victoria's expression softened slightly, which somehow made her words more cutting. "I think you love him too much to let him destroy his relationships with everyone else he's ever cared about. I think you're too smart to believe that passion alone can sustain a marriage across such different worlds." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Love isn't always enough, is it? Not when the cost is everything else. Family harmony, social standing, business relationships, generational responsibility. James will choose you if you force him to choose. But what kind of love asks someone to abandon everything they've ever known?" After Victoria left, Clara sat alone in her apartment for hours, staring at the framed photograph of her parents. They had loved each other deeply, but they had also understood their place in the world, had never tried to reach beyond what seemed possible. For the first time since standing up in that courtroom, Clara began to wonder if courage meant holding on or letting go. The pressure was mounting from all sides: family disapproval, social ostracism, the constant weight of being the outsider in James's world. And slowly, insidiously, Victoria's words were taking root. Maybe love wasn't enough when two people came from worlds this far apart. The war for James Whitfield's future was reaching its climax, and Clara was beginning to question whether she was fighting for his happiness or destroying it. The decision crystallized on a Thursday morning in late March, when Clara found herself staring at a newspaper photo of James attending a charity gala with Amanda Thornton. The caption read, "Chicago's most eligible bachelor, spotted with banking heiress." James's smile looked forced, his posture rigid, but he was there. fulfilling family obligations, while she fought cases in courtrooms across the city. That afternoon, she called him. "Can we meet tonight? At Rose's Cafe?" There was something in her voice, a finality that made James's stomach clench with dread. "Of course. Clara, is everything all right? We need to talk." Rose's Cafe on the South Side had been their sanctuary, the place where their love story had begun, over coffee and honest conversation. The irony wasn't lost on either of them, that it would also be where that story reached its most painful chapter. James arrived first, choosing the same corner booth where they'd sat 9 months earlier, when the world had felt full of possibility. When Clara walked through the door, he could see she'd been crying. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her usual composed demeanor cracked around the edges. She slid into the booth across from him, and for a long moment neither spoke. The familiar sounds of the neighborhood cafe, coffee grinding, Spanish conversations, the clink of ceramic mugs provided a soundtrack to their silence. "I can't do this anymore," Clara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. James felt his world tilt. "Can't do what?" "This. Us. Watching you fight your family every day because of me. Seeing you lose relationships that took a lifetime to build. Those relationships don't matter if they can't accept the woman I love." "They do matter, James. They're your family, your history, your foundation. I can't be the reason you lose all of that." He reached across the table for her hands, but she pulled them back, wrapping her arms around herself like armor. "You're not losing me anything. You're giving me everything that matters." "Am I?" Clara's voice cracked. "Or am I just disrupting your life? Your mother came to see me last week." James's expression darkened. What did she say? Nothing I hadn't already been thinking. Clara met his eyes, and he could see the pain there, the doubt that had been planted and carefully cultivated. "She's right about one thing. We come from different worlds, and trying to bridge that gap is tearing both our worlds apart. Our worlds don't matter. We create our own world together. But we don't exist in isolation, James. Your family, your business, your responsibilities, they're all part of who you are. And watching you sacrifice them for me, it's killing something inside me." James leaned forward desperately. "I'm not sacrificing anything. I'm choosing what matters most. What if I don't want to be what matters most? What if I want to be Clara Morales, attorney, not James Whitfield's controversial girlfriend who tears families apart?" The words hung between them like a chasm neither knew how to cross. James stared at her, trying to understand how the woman who had shown such courage in a courtroom could be running away from the best thing that had ever happened to either of them. "So what are you saying?" Clara's voice broke completely. "I'm saying I need space. I need time to figure out who I am, when I'm not constantly defending my right to love you. You don't have to defend anything to anyone, but I do. Every day. Every family gathering, every social event, every business dinner where I'm introduced as James's friend instead of his girlfriend because your family can't bear to acknowledge what we are. That will change. When? After we're married and your mother spends the rest of her life treating our children like they're somehow less than? After your sister's kids learn to look down on their cousins because of whose blood they carry?" James fell silent because they both knew she was right. The Whitfield family's acceptance wasn't coming. If anything, their opposition was hardening with time. "I love you," he said quietly. "That has to count for something. It counts for everything. But maybe love isn't enough when it costs this much." They sat in silence for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Around them, life continued, families sharing meals, friends catching up over coffee, couples planning futures that seemed possible. But in their corner booth, two people who had found extraordinary love were discovering it might not be sustainable. "So this is it?" James asked finally. Clara nodded, tears streaming freely now. "For now, I need to be just me for a while. Not half of something that's causing everyone pain. You're not causing pain. My family's prejudices are causing pain. Same result." James stood up slowly, his movements careful like a man who'd been wounded but was trying not to show it. "I won't stop loving you. Time apart isn't going to change that. I know. But maybe it will help us both figure out if love is enough to build a life on." He kissed her forehead, gentle, lingering, final, and walked out of Rose's cafe without looking back. Clara sat alone in the booth for another hour, crying into cold coffee and wondering if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. The months that followed were a study in parallel misery. Clara threw herself into her work with the desperation of someone trying to outrun heartbreak. 18-hour days became her norm. She took every difficult case, every media interview, every speaking engagement that came her way. The Chicago Legal Review featured her on their cover as the People's Champion. Harvard offered her a visiting professorship. 3 different publishers wanted to turn her story into a book. Professionally, she was becoming everything she'd dreamed of. Personally, she felt like she was disappearing, piece by piece. She avoided news about James with the dedication of someone in witness protection, changed channels when Whitfield Clean Energy appeared in business reports, declined social events where she might encounter mutual acquaintances, built walls around her heart that grew higher with each passing week. But Chicago was a small world for people in their circles. Information filtered through anyway. James was attending family events again, appearing at charity galas with appropriate companions. His company won a major federal contract for renewable energy infrastructure. Business magazines featured him as Chicago's most eligible bachelor with increasing frequency. He looked successful, handsome, perfectly suited to his world. He also looked hollow. James was indeed going through the motions of his former life, but it felt like performing in a play written for someone else. Board meetings blurred together. Charity events became exercises in endurance. The women his mother strategically introduced, Amanda, Catherine, Claire, were accomplished, beautiful, and completely wrong. "You seem distracted lately," his assistant mentioned during a particularly unfocused week in June. "Just thinking about the Morrison contract." He lied. The Morrison contract was signed 2 months ago. The truth was that everything reminded him of Clara. The courthouse where they'd first seen each other, the lake where they'd shared their first kiss, the coffee shop where she'd broken his heart. Even his clean energy projects felt hollow, without her passionate voice explaining why they mattered. His family was pleased with what they saw as his return to reason. Victoria arranged dinner parties with eligible women. Charlotte made pointed comments about how much happier he seemed. Robert Sr. praised his renewed focus on business. But late at night, alone in his penthouse apartment, James stared out at the Chicago skyline and felt like he was living someone else's life. Victoria noticed the change first, the way her son's smiles never reached his eyes anymore, how he went through social motions without genuine engagement. The charming, driven man who had built a billion-dollar empire was becoming a polite stranger who happened to share her son's face. "He's not happy," she confided to Robert Sr. after a particularly lifeless family dinner in July. "He'll adjust." Young men always think their first real heartbreak is the end of the world. This isn't adjustment. This is emptiness. 3 months after the separation, Victoria did something she never thought she would. She began researching Clara Morales in earnest. Not to find scandal this time, but to understand what her son had lost. What she discovered surprised her. Articles about Clara's legal victories revealed not just professional success, but genuine care for justice. Interviews showed a woman of substance and integrity. Photos from speaking engagements captured someone who had built something meaningful from nothing. The turning point came when Victoria watched a local news interview where Clara was asked about her personal life. "Any romantic interests, Ms. Morales?" Our viewers are curious about Chicago's most eligible bachelorette. For just a moment, Clara's composed mask slipped. Victoria saw real pain flash across her face, the look of someone who had lost something precious and was still learning to live with that loss. "I'm focused on my work right now," Clara answered carefully. "There are families depending on me to fight for their rights. That's where my energy needs to be. No regrets about ending your relationship with billionaire James Whitfield?" The pause was barely perceptible, but Victoria caught it. Sometimes love isn't enough to bridge very different worlds. That doesn't make the love less real. It just makes it impossible. After the interview ended, Victoria sat in her Lake Forest living room and realized what she had done. She hadn't protected her son from an unsuitable woman. She had driven away the only person who had ever made him truly happy. That night, she made a decision that would require more courage than she'd ever needed in her privileged life. It was time to fix what her prejudice had broken. The war was over, and everyone had lost. But perhaps, with enough humility and honesty, the peace negotiations could begin. If you've ever had to choose between love and everything else you thought mattered, you know this pain. Before we get to the resolution, tell me in the comments, do you think Clara made the right choice? And if this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, smash that subscribe button because the ending will restore your faith in love, conquering all. The knock on Clara's apartment door came on a rainy Thursday evening in late August, 6 months after the separation that had torn both their worlds apart. Clara was reviewing case files for a major environmental lawsuit. Her small living room transformed into a war room of legal documents and evidence. The sound startled her. She rarely had unexpected visitors anymore, having built walls around her personal life that few dared to cross. Through the peephole, she saw the last person she expected, Victoria Whitfield, standing in the hallway of her modest Pilsen building like a queen visiting a foreign country. This time, however, something was different. The older woman's usual imperious bearing was replaced by something that looked almost like humility. Clara opened the door slowly, confusion evident on her face. "Mrs. Whitfield." "Clara, may I come in? I believe we have much to discuss." Unlike her previous visit, Victoria's tone held no condescension, no hidden daggers wrapped in politeness. She seemed genuinely uncertain. For perhaps the first time in her privileged life, Victoria Whitfield wasn't sure she had the right to demand anything. "Of course, please, sit down. Can I offer you coffee this time?" Victoria paused, remembering how she had coldly refused hospitality during their last encounter. "Yes, thank you. I would like that very much." As Clara prepared coffee in her small kitchen, she watched Victoria through the doorway. The older woman was studying the framed photographs on Clara's bookshelf, her parents' wedding picture, her law school graduation, a photo of her with clients whose case she'd won. When Victoria picked up the image of Clara with the Peterson family after their victory against Midwest Manufacturing, her expression softened in a way Clara had never seen before. "I've been following your work," Victoria said when Clara returned with 2 steaming mugs. "The Peterson case, the environmental lawsuit against Great Lakes Chemical, your speech at Northwestern Law. You've accomplished remarkable things." Clara settled into the chair across from her, wary but curious. "Thank you." Victoria took a careful sip of coffee, then set down the mug with trembling hands. "I owe you an apology. More than an apology, I owe you the truth." The words hung in the small apartment like a confession waiting to be heard. "I was wrong about you," Victoria continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "About your motivations, about your character, about your feelings for my son. I was wrong about everything that mattered." Clara said nothing, letting the silence encourage Victoria to continue. "I've spent 6 months watching James become a shell of the man he used to be. Oh, he goes through the motions, attends the charity events, takes the meetings, even dates the women I've introduced him to. But there's nothing there anymore. No joy, no passion, no life." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "I thought I was protecting him from someone who would use him. Instead, I drove away the only woman who ever made him truly happy. The only woman who ever made him truly good. He was always good," Clara said quietly, the first words she'd spoken since Victoria began her confession. "He was successful. He was accomplished. But with you, he became something more. He became someone who cared about more than profit margins and board meetings. Someone who wanted to change the world. because you showed him it needed changing." Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping the interview where Clara had been asked about their relationship. "I watched you on television. I saw your face when they asked about James. I realized that I hadn't just hurt my son, I'd hurt you too. And you never fought back, never tried to turn him against his family. You just suffered in silence and let me win a war that destroyed everyone involved." Clara felt tears building behind her eyes. "Mrs. Whitfield, why are you telling me this? Because he still loves you. Every day, every moment, it's written all over his face. And unless I'm very much mistaken, you still love him too." The tears came freely now. Clara had spent 6 months trying to convince herself that she'd made the right choice, that love wasn't enough to overcome such different worlds. But hearing Victoria acknowledge the depth of that love from the woman who had fought hardest against it broke something loose inside her. "I can't promise it will be easy," Victoria continued. "Society can be cruel, and my social circle can be particularly vicious. But if you're willing to try again, you'll have my support. More importantly, you'll have my respect." "And your family?" Victoria's smile was sad but genuine. "My family needs to learn what I learned too late, that love like yours and James's doesn't come along often. And when it does, you fight for it instead of against it." After Victoria left, Clara sat alone in her apartment for hours, staring at the business card Victoria had left behind, James's office address and phone number, though Clara had memorized both months ago. She thought about courage, about the different forms it could take. Standing up in a courtroom had required one kind of bravery. This would require another entirely. 3 days later, on a Friday evening when the Willis Towers offices were mostly empty, Clara took the elevator to the 47th floor. Whitfield, Clean Energy's reception area, was dark, but she could see light spilling from James's corner office. She walked past empty desks and conference rooms, her heels clicking on marble floors that reminded her of another life, another version of herself. James was standing at his window, looking out at the Chicago skyline, and when he turned at the sound of her approach, his face cycled through a dozen emotions in seconds: surprise, hope, pain, joy, uncertainty, love. "Clara." "Hello, James." They stared at each other across the office. Two people who had lived in each other's hearts for months while being apart. "Your mother came to see me," Clara said finally. James's expression darkened with familiar protective anger. "What did she say?" "If she hurt you again, she apologized. And she told me something I needed to hear." Clara stepped closer, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "She said you still love me. Every day," he said without hesitation. "Every moment. I never stopped." "I never stopped either." The confession poured out of her like water through a broken dam. "I thought I needed to choose between loving you and being myself. But I realized something during these months apart. The woman I am now, the woman I'm proud to be, exists partly because you believed in her first." James crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, and the kiss that followed tasted like coming home after the longest, most difficult journey imaginable. "I'm so sorry," he whispered against her hair. "Sorry for the pressure. Sorry for my family. Sorry for letting you go. I'm sorry too. Sorry for running instead of fighting for us." "We're fighting now," he said, pulling back to look at her. "Together, the way it should have been from the beginning." "Together?" she agreed, and when they kissed again, the Chicago skyline sparkled around them, like a promise of everything they could build with love as their foundation. 2 years later, Clara stood on the courthouse steps where their story had begun, wearing a simple white dress and holding the hand of the man who had seen her courage before she knew she possessed it. James was looking at her like she was the most beautiful thing in the world, which, in his eyes, she absolutely was. "2 years ago, I watched you change the world in 5 minutes, he said, dropping to one knee as reporters and passers-by gathered around them. "You've been changing my world every day since." Clara Morales, brilliant attorney, fierce advocate, love of my life, will you marry me?" "Yes," she whispered, then louder, laughing through tears of joy. "Yes." Their wedding 6 months later took place in a community center in Clara's old neighborhood, mixing Supreme Court justices with subway conductors, billionaires with construction workers, proving that love really could unite different worlds instead of dividing them. Years later, as federal judge Clara Morales Whitfield and clean energy pioneer James Whitfield worked together on their foundation, providing legal aid to workers nationwide, they kept that tattered newspaper clipping framed in their office, the article about the custodian who refused to stay invisible, because sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand up and speak your truth, regardless of who's listening. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, the right person will not only hear you, they'll spend their life amplifying your voice until the whole world has no choice but to listen. My family, this story proves that courage changes everything, not just for yourself, but for everyone watching. If Clara's bravery inspired you, hit that like button. If you believe love can overcome any obstacle, subscribe for more stories that matter. And share this with someone who needs to hear that their voice counts, their dreams matter, and their love is worth fighting for. Thank you for letting me share this journey with you. Until next time, remember, you're never invisible to the people who matter.